The fire crackled low against the October sky, casting dancing shadows across the weathered lines of Jackson Brennan's face. The desert night pressed in around them, vast and indifferent, the kind of darkness that made a man feel small and mortal. Above, stars burned with cold intensity, the same stars that had watched everything unfold 3 years ago, the same stars that knew all the secrets Jack was about to share. 14-year-old Danny Ward sat across from him, young enough to still believe the world made sense, old enough to understand that sometimes it didn't. The boy had been quiet during their 3-day ride from Santa Fe, but Jack knew that silence. He had worn it himself once, back when questions burned hotter than any campfire, and the world seemed full of mysteries only grown men could understand. Danny reached forward to add mesquite to the flames, and in the firelight, James Ward looked back at Jack through his son's eyes, same determined set to the jaw. The boy had his father's courage, even if he didn't know it yet, especially when he was afraid. "When did you get that scar?" Danny asked, pointing to the raised line of tissue that showed through the tear in Jack's shirt, pale against sun-darkened skin. Jack's hand moved to his shoulder automatically, fingers tracing the old wound. 5 full seconds passed before he spoke, and when he did, his voice carried the weight of those 3 years like stones in a river. 3 years back. The boy waited, knowing better than to rush a story from a man like Jack. In the years since his father died, Danny had learned that Jackson Brennan measured his words the way a prospector measured gold. Carefully, precisely, never wasting a single grain. "Were you ever scared?" The question hung in the desert air between them, simple and profound. Jack picked up a stick and prodded the fire, sending sparks spiraling up toward the infinite dark. Another long pause followed, the kind that made younger men uncomfortable, but which Danny had learned to respect. When Jack finally met the boy's eyes, there was something in his gaze that it looked like true strip bear. Every single day, for 3 months straight, Danny leaned forward, his shadow growing long across the sand. The night sounds of the desert filled the space between them. A coyote calling somewhere in the distance, the whisper of wind across ancient stone, the soft settling of the fire. Jack set down the stick and pulled his coat tighter against the October chill. At 35, his face looked older than his years, carved by sun and wind and choices that left marks deeper than any blade. Gray was beginning to thread through the brown of his beard, and his hands bore the calluses of a man who had worked hard for everything he ever had. "Son," he began, his voice settling into the rhythm of storytelling, "I'm going to tell you about the time I had to choose between 2 things. Keeping a promise to a dead man or letting you become an orphan for the second time. The year was 1882. I was 32 years old. You were 11. And I learned that sometimes the only way to keep a promise is to break every rule you ever knew." The fire popped and settled. Jack reached into his saddlebag and pulled out his Winchester Model 1873, the rifle that had traveled with him since the war ended. His hands moved with practiced ease as he checked the mechanism. 15 rounds ready to fire from a 24-inch barrel that had saved his life more times than he could count. The weapon gleamed dully in the firelight. More companion than tool, he set the rifle across his knees and looked out into the darkness beyond their small circle of warmth. Somewhere out there, miles away across the desert floor, lay the ranch he and Nayeli had built from blood and determination. Somewhere beyond that lay the graves of men who had made different choices, paid different prices. "Summer of 1882, Jack continued. "We rode into a town called Red Ridge on the hottest June day I can remember. 105 degrees in the shade, and there wasn't much shade to be found. We were looking for work in the silver mines nearby, and we were down to our last $18. He paused, remembering the weight of that heat, the way it pressed down like a physical thing. The way Danny had looked then, smaller and thinner, still carrying the hollow look of a child who had lost everything. Your father, James, had been dead 1 year. He made me promise before he died that I would take care of you. Not because I owed him anything, though I did. He pulled me out of a burning supply wagon at Shiloh, saved my life while bullets were flying thick as hornets. But that wasn't why he asked. He asked because that's what men do. We don't abandon the families of the men who fought beside us." The words came slowly now, each one measured and placed with care. Jack was not a man who spoke of emotion directly. He showed it through action, through the steady presence that had kept Danny fed and safe and taught for the past 3 years. But tonight, with the fire low and the story demanding to be told, he allowed himself this small vulnerability. Redridge was not much of a town, 300 people, one sheriff, two saloons, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business before breakfast. We needed money. I needed work. You needed a place to sleep that didn't involve the hard ground every night. Jack stood and walked to his horse, a sturdy Mustang that had carried him across half of New Mexico. From the saddlebag, he pulled out a leather canteen, took a long drink, then offered it to Danny. The boy drank, then handed it back, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. So we found a cheap hotel room, $1 for the night, and I went to the saloon to ask about the mines. The memory came back sharp and clear, the smell of whiskey and tobacco, the sound of cards shuffling and coins clinking, the way conversation stopped when he walked in, the way eyes measured him and found him wanting or dangerous or both. In the saloon, men were talking about a man named Harlan Blackwell. They said he was the most powerful man in the territory, owned the biggest ranch, controlled the water rights to 3 creeks, had enough money to buy and sell half the town. 12,000 acres under his name. They said he was looking for someone, but the man they sent before me had disappeared into the desert and never came back. Danny shifted uneasily. Jack sat back down, his movements slow and deliberate. An old gunfighter pulled me aside. His name was Frank Wilson, but everyone called him Scarface on account of the knife wound that ran from his temple to his jaw. He told me not to take any job from Harlan Blackwell. When I asked why, he looked at me like I was already dead. Jack paused, letting the weight of that look settle into his memory. He said the last man who worked for Blackwell rode out into the desert and no one ever saw him again. I asked if maybe the man just left town. Frank shook his head, and what he said next, I never forgot. The fire crackled, and Jack fed it another piece of dried mesquite, watching the wood catch and burn. He said in a desert like this, leaving and disappearing are the same thing. A long silence followed. Jack let it stretch, let Danny feel the weight of those words. The boy's face showed he understood. Out here, 100 miles from the nearest real city, a man could vanish as completely as if the earth had swallowed him whole. But you took the job anyway, Danny said quietly. I didn't have a choice, Jack said simply. Not really. We were down to our last money. The mines weren't hiring, and I had you to think about. He paused again, remembering that moment of decision, the way fear and necessity had wrestled inside him until necessity won by simple exhaustion. Before I could decide anything, 6 of Blackwell's men surrounded me outside the saloon. They were not gentle about it. They told me their boss wanted to see me. They told me to come quiet or not come at all. Jack's jaw tightened at the memory. They knew my name, knew about you, knew I was a scout in the war, knew which battles I'd fought in, knew how your father died. Harlan Blackwell was the kind of man who learned everything about a person before he made them an offer. So I went. Didn't have much choice in that either. He stood and walked to the edge of their firelight, looking out into the vast darkness of the desert. They took me to the Blackwell Ranch. It was built like a fortress. Adobe walls 2 feet deep, iron bars on every window. The kind of place a man builds when he knows enemies are coming and wants to be ready. The kind of place that says the man inside has reason to be afraid. Jack turned back to Danny, his face half in shadow. Harlan Blackwell was waiting in his study. He was 56 years old then, but he looked older. Tall man, over 6 feet, with gray hair and a scar that ran from his forehead down to his cheek. A knife scar, not from an accident. His eyes were cold, the coldness that comes from making hard decisions and living with them. He sat back down, his movements slow and tired. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He looked at me like he was measuring livestock and said, I hear you were a scout in the war. I told him yes. He asked if I was any good. I told him I was still alive. He nodded like that was the only answer that mattered. The fire burned lower. Jack fed it again, his hands steady despite the memories churning through him. Then he told me his daughter needed a husband. Just like that. No explanation, no introduction. My daughter needs a husband. 5 simple words that changed everything. Danny made a small sound, halfway between surprise and understanding. Jack continued, his voice level and measured. I told him I didn't need a wife. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He said maybe I didn't need a wife, but I did need land, money, and a future for the boy I was raising. Jack pulled out a small gold coin from his pocket, a $20 gold eagle he had carried since the war ended. He turned it over in his fingers, letting the firelight catch the worn edges. He offered me 5,000 acres of land, a silver mine. Property, he said, was worth $200,000. All I had to do was marry his daughter, protect her, and help secure her inheritance. He had legal documents, old papers about land ownership going back to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Made it all sound legitimate and straightforward. Jack looked at Danny steadily. I asked what was wrong with her. That's the first question any sensible man would ask when a rich rancher is offering a fortune to marry a woman you've never met. Something had to be wrong. The boy leaned forward, completely absorbed now. Harlan Blackwell told me she was Apache, said she'd been raised by savages, that she was too wild, too difficult, too unmarriageable by normal standards. He said she was the kind of woman no civilized man would want, and that only someone who needed the land badly enough would agree. Someone desperate. Jack paused, choosing his next words carefully. I asked what happened if I refused. Blackwell didn't answer with words. He just looked out the window toward where you were playing with one of the ranch dogs in the courtyard. You were throwing sticks, laughing, being 11 years old and trying not to think about how your father was gone and your whole world had changed. The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Then he looked back at me. That was all. No threats, no raised voice, just that look. The message was clear as a rifle shot. Agreed to marry his daughter or something bad would happen to you, and I'd broken my promise to your father. Danny swallowed hard. Jack continued, his voice steady despite the emotion underlying the words. I told him I wanted to meet his daughter first, see her, talk to her, hear her side of things. He agreed too quickly, which told me everything I needed to know. This was not a negotiation. This was a trap disguised as an opportunity. But he made one condition before I could meet her. Jack's hands tightened slightly on the gold coin. You would stay at his ranch while I traveled to the Apache camp where she lived. Insurance, he called it. Insurance that I would come back. Because if I disappeared into the desert like that other man, you'd be the one who paid the price. The fire popped loudly in the silence that followed. Jack stood again and paced to the edge of the firelight, his shadow long and dark against the desert floor. I knelt down to your eye level that morning before I left. Do you remember what I asked you? Danny nodded slowly. You asked me what I would do if you didn't come back in 3 days. And what did you say? Said I'd ride to Santa Fe and find Sheriff Morgan, just like we practiced. Jack smiled slightly, a ghost of expression in the firelight. You were trying so hard to be brave. 11 years old and trying to be the man your father wanted you to become. And then you asked me the question I knew was coming. I asked if you would come back, Danny said quietly. You did. And I didn't answer right away because I don't lie to you and I never have. I looked at you for 5 long seconds, weighing the promise against the danger, weighing what I owed your father against what might happen if I couldn't keep that promise. Jack sat back down, the memory still sharp and painful after all these years. Then I told you yes, I promised I would come back. Because I'd promised your father I would take care of you, and a man who breaks one promise will break another. I told you that I keep my promises. Always. The desert wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of sage and creosote across their small camp. The fire danced and swayed, throwing shifting patterns across both their faces. The next morning, Blackwell, 8 of his gunmen, and I rode out, 40 miles through the Chihuahuan Desert. 2 days of riding through heat that reached 105 degrees. We carried 2 gallons of water per person per day and rationed every drop like it was liquid gold. Jack demonstrated with his hands, showing the size of the leather canteens they had used. The desert out there is not like anything you've seen before. Saguaro cacti taller than houses, mountains that look close but take days to reach. Heat that makes the air shimmer and turns men stupid if they don't respect it. Rattlesnakes under every rock, scorpions in your boots if you're not careful, and dehydration that can kill you before you even realize you're in trouble. He paused, remembering the journey with perfect clarity. I watched Blackwell's men during that ride, studied them the way I used to study enemy positions during the war. They were afraid of him, not loyal, just afraid. And there's a world of difference between those two things. Danny nodded, beginning to understand. Loyalty means a man will follow you into danger because he believes in what you're doing. Fear means he'll follow you because the danger of refusing is worse than the danger ahead. Those men feared Harlan Blackwell more than they feared the desert, more than they feared whatever waited for them at the Apache camp. That told me something important about the kind of man he was. The second night of that long-ago journey came back to Jack in vivid detail. On the second night, we made camp near a dry creek bed. The men built a fire and drank whiskey. One of them, a young gunfighter named Billy Turner, maybe 19 years old, got drunk enough to talk. He pulled me aside, away from the others, and told me I shouldn't have agreed to come. Jack's voice dropped lower, more intense. Billy told me that Blackwell's daughter had killed two men who refused to marry her, that she was dangerous, violent, unpredictable, the kind of woman who could gut a man with a knife and not lose a moment's sleep over it. I asked him if he'd seen this happen. He admitted he had not. It was just what people said, what everyone knew, rumors and whispers and stories told in saloons. Jack met Danny's eyes directly. I told him that rumors are not the same as truth, that I'd learned a long time ago to trust what I could see with my own eyes more than what people claimed to know. He looked at me like I was a fool, but he didn't say anything else, just went back to the fire and his whiskey. The fire was burning low again. Jack let it, letting the darkness creep closer as his story moved toward his first turning point. Morning came with the same brutal heat. We rode through country that got more rugged with every mile, and by afternoon of the third day, we reached the Mescalero Apache camp near the Sacramento Mountains. About 40 wickiups, traditional shelters made from bent willow branches covered with animal hide or dried grass. Maybe 150 people lived there. It was a permanent camp, not temporary. These people had been there for generations, living the way their ancestors had lived. Jack's voice took on a tone of respect, the kind earned through experience rather than assumption. The first thing I noticed was how organized everything was. Children playing in groups, women working together preparing food and hides, men maintaining weapons and tools. It wasn't savage, it wasn't walled, it was a community, same as any town I'd ever seen, just built different and run by different rules. He leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching his eyes. The Apache chief came out to meet us. His name was Taze. He was 66 years old, with long white hair and scars across his chest from old battles, the kind of scars that tell you a man has seen combat and survived when others didn't. He had presence, the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Jack smiled slightly at the memory. Taze didn't speak English to Blackwell. That was deliberate. It was his way of showing disrespect, of making it clear that Blackwell was not welcome here and not in charge. But he spoke English to me. Perfect English. Better than half the men in Red Ridge could manage. The significance of that distinction was not lost on Danny, and Jack saw the understanding dawn in the boy's eyes. Taze said Blackwell told him I was a good man. I said Blackwell didn't know me. Then Taze asked me a question I wasn't expecting. He asked if I'd ever killed to protect someone. Jack paused, letting the weight of that question settle. I nodded. Didn't need to explain. He understood, and then he said something I've never forgotten. He said, then you understand the value of a life, and that's all that matters. The old chief's words still carried power, even 3 years later. Jack felt them resonate through the telling. Taze took me to his private lodge, away from Blackwell and the others. He poured tea made from the creosote plant, traditional Apache medicine. We sat in silence for 10 full seconds, just drinking and looking at each other. No words, just evaluation. He was measuring me the same way I was measuring him, trying to figure out if I was worth trusting with what he was about to tell me. Jack shifted his position, settling in for the crucial part of the story. Then he began to talk. He told me that the woman Blackwell wanted me to marry, Her name was Nayeli. It means she who is loved in Apache. Her mother was Tazai's sister, a woman named Ayana, who had married Harlan Blackwell 26 years before, back in 1856 when things were different between the Apache and the white settlers. The history unfolded slowly, carefully, each detail building on the last. Ayana died 12 years ago, when Nayeli was 13 years old. Blackwell sent the girl to live with the Apache, told Tazai it would only be for 6 months, just until things settled down and he could properly grieve his wife. He promised he'd come back for his daughter, promised he wouldn't abandon her. Jack's voice hardened slightly. 12 years, Danny. 12 years Blackwell never came back. Never sent a letter, never sent a message, never explained. Nayeli grew up believing her father had abandoned her because she reminded him too much of her dead mother. She learned Apache ways, became one of the people, and Taze raised her as his own daughter. The injustice of it still burned even after all this time. Then a few months before I arrived, Blackwell suddenly returned. Suddenly decided it was time for Nayeli to come back, time for her to marry and secure her inheritance. And that's when Taze started asking questions. Because 12 years is a long time to wait, and the timing seems suspicious. Jack leaned back, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone. I asked Taze why Blackwell really wanted Nayeli back after all this time. The old chief smiled, but there was no humor in it, no warmth, just the cold satisfaction of a man who had figured out another man's lies. This was the first major reveal, and Jack let the pause stretch before continuing. Taze told me that the land Nayeli inherited from her mother was worth far more than the $200,000 Blackwell claimed. The silver mine had never been fully explored. Early surveys suggested it could be worth $500,000, maybe as much as $750,000, maybe more if the vein ran deep enough. Danny's eyes widened. He understood what that kind of money meant. Harlan Blackwell had lied about the value. He needed Nayeli's land to pay his debts, but he also saw an opportunity to become truly wealthy. If she married someone he could control, Blackwell could manage the mine and keep most of the profits. Nayeli would have legal ownership but no real power. She'd be a figurehead while her father got rich off her inheritance. Jack stood again and walked to his saddle, pulling out a worn leather journal. He'd kept notes during those days, trying to make sense of the legal complexities that had seemed overwhelming at the time. But there was another man involved. A banker named Samuel Garrett, who owned the bank in Red Ridge. Before he bought the bank, Garrett had been a notorious land grabber. He would loan money at impossible rates, then use forged court documents to seize property when people couldn't pay. The pattern of predation was clear and calculated. Garrett had stolen land from 15 families in 5 years, used the law like a weapon, twisting it to his own purposes. And now he wanted Nayeli's land. Wanted it bad enough to kill for it. So Jack opened the journal showing Danny the careful calculations he'd made. Taze explained the debt to me in detail. Blackwell owed $50,000 to Garrett's bank. The debt had grown from $10,000 he borrowed back in 1878, 20% interest per year, compounded. I did the mathematics right there in Taze's lodge. He pointed to the numbers written in faded ink. $10,000 times 1.2 raised to the 7th power. That's the formula for compound interest. Came out to about $35,000 just from the interest alone. Add in penalties and fees, and you get $50,000 total. Blackwell couldn't pay. He had nothing left. Everything he owned was mortgaged beyond its value. The trap was complete, and Jack made sure Danny understood every piece of it. So Garrett came to Blackwell with a proposition, simple and brutal. Get someone to marry Nayeli. The husband would legally control the property under New Mexico territorial law because unmarried women couldn't own more than 640 acres. Then Garrett would pressure or bribe or threaten that husband into signing over the mineral rights. After that, arrange an accident. The husband dies. Nayeli becomes a widow with no claim to anything. Garrett owns the mine, Blackwell's debts get cleared, and everyone's satisfied. Everyone except the dead man and the woman left with nothing. Danny's face had gone pale in the firelight. Jack let him process that before continuing. The 2 men who came before me, the ones who supposedly refused to marry her, they didn't refuse. They agreed, just like Blackwell wanted, but they disappeared anyway. Bodies never found. because Garrett couldn't risk them talking, couldn't risk them having second thoughts, or going to the territorial governor. Easier to kill them in the desert where no one would ever find the remains. The casual cruelty of it made the desert night feel colder. Taze told me all of this not to scare me away, but to give me the truth. He said I was the first man who'd ask questions, the first one who seemed to care about anything beyond the money. And he wanted me to understand exactly what I was walking into. Jack closed the journal and set it aside. I asked Taze why he was telling me all this, why he should trust me, a stranger hired by the man who'd abandoned his niece. And you know what he said? Danny shook his head. He said he didn't know if he should trust me, but I asked questions. That was more than the other men had done. And sometimes asking the right questions is the first step toward finding the truth. The fire had burned down to coals now, glowing red and orange in the darkness. Jack added more wood, building it back up as his story approached its climax. Taze gave me one final warning before I left his lodge. He said if I truly wanted to help Nayeli, I should meet her alone that night, away from Blackwell, away from the camp, somewhere we could speak honestly, without fear of being overheard or interrupted. Jack's voice took on a different quality now, something almost reverent. So I waited until after dark. The camp was settling down for the night, fires burning low, people moving to their shelters. I walked toward the small stream that ran past the edge of the settlement, following the sound of water over stones. And that's where I found her. He paused, letting the moment breathe. Nayeli was kneeling by the stream, washing her face. She had taken off the ceremonial bandana that Apache women wore during the day, the one that had covered part of her face during my arrival. Her back was to me, but I could see her reflection in the water, lit by moonlight. The description came slowly, each detail painted with care. Harlan Blackwell had called her wild, unmarriageable, too difficult for any civilized man. But the woman I saw was none of those things. She had high cheekbones, the strong features of her Apache heritage. Dark eyes that seemed to hold storms, eyes that had seen hardship and survived it. Long black hair that fell past her waist, black as the night shined above us. Skin darkened by years under the desert sun. A small scar on her chin from some old hunting accident. Jack looked directly at Danny. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with softness or conventional standards. She was beautiful the way a hawk is beautiful. Wild and strong and completely herself. Unapologetic and unbroken despite everything that had been done to her. The boy was staring at Jack with new understanding, beginning to see the woman who would become like a mother to him. Nayeli knew I was there, didn't even turn around, just spoke to the water, her voice clear and measured. She asked if I thought she was savage. Jack smiled slightly at the memory. I said no. She asked why her father said she was. I told her it was to keep men from coming for her. Only someone desperate enough for land would accept Blackwell's offer if they thought they were getting a wild, unmarriageable woman. It was protection of a sort, even if it was also manipulation. The conversation that followed had changed everything. Nayeli was quiet for 5 seconds. Then she turned to look at me, studied my face in the moonlight for a long moment before she spoke. She said I was smarter than she expected, that most men just accepted what they were told without thinking deeper. Jack chose his next words carefully. I told her I'd learned to pay attention to what men don't say as much as what they do say. That the silences and the evasions often tell you more than the actual words. She seemed to appreciate that. Said I was the first man who came here who didn't already have all the answers ready. The turning point was approaching, and Jack let the anticipation build. Then she asked me what I wanted. It was a fair question. I'd traveled 2 days through the desert to meet her, agreed to a marriage arranged by a man neither of us trusted, walked into a situation that had already killed 2 men. She deserved to know my intentions. Jack met Danny's eyes directly. I told her the truth. I said I hadn't decided yet, that I needed to understand everything before I made my choice. And Danny, you should have seen her face. She was genuinely surprised. Said I was the first man who didn't already know what he wanted before he even met her. The vulnerability in that moment still resonated. So I asked her the same question. What did she want? She looked at me for 8 full seconds. just studying my face in the moonlight. I could see her weighing whether to trust me, whether to tell me the truth, or give me the answer she thought I wanted to hear. Jack's voice dropped lower, more intense, and then she told me everything. About her father abandoning her, about the two men who came before me and how they disappeared, about Samuel Garrett and his plan to take her land by any means necessary, about how if I married her, Garrett would kill me to get control of the property, and if I refused, Blackwell couldn't let me leave, knowing too much. Either way, I was likely to die. The brutal honesty of it hung in the air. She wasn't trying to scare me. She was tired of lies, tired of manipulation and half-truths, and men who pretended to care while really just wanting her inheritance. She wanted me to know exactly what I was choosing if I agreed to go through with the marriage. Jack stood one final time, his silhouette dark against the stars. I asked her what she truly wanted underneath all the legal complications and her father's schemes, and she told me she didn't want to marry anyone. She wanted to be free. Free from her father's manipulation, free from Garrett's threats, free to live on her own terms. But freedom seemed impossible given the circumstances. He turned back to Danny. I told her I would think about it, that I needed to understand everything before making my choice. She nodded and said I had until morning. Then she walked back toward the camp, leaving me alone by the stream with the sound of water flowing and the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on me. The fire crackled, sending up a shower of sparks. Jack watched them rise and fade like the ghosts of choices not made. I sat there by that stream for over an hour, Danny, thinking about your father's promise, thinking about you back at Blackwell's ranch, trusting that I'd come back like I said I would, thinking about Nayeli and the trap she was caught in through no fault of her own, thinking about two dead men whose bodies were rotting somewhere in the desert. His voice grew quieter, more reflective, and I realized something sitting there. I'd spent my whole life trying to do the right thing, trying to keep my word and be the kind of man your father believed I was. But sometimes there is no right choice. Sometimes you just have to pick the path that lets you sleep at night and hope it leads somewhere worth going. Jack sat back down next to Danny, close enough that the boy could see the firelight reflected in his eyes. The next morning I made my decision, and that decision changed everything. He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. But that's where the story gets complicated, son. That's where I learned that sometimes the person who seems to need protecting is stronger than anyone imagined. And that's where your mother proved she was the kind of woman who could save herself and everyone around her if given half a chance. Danny opened his mouth to speak, but Jack held up a hand. Tomorrow night I'll tell you about the wedding ceremony, about what happened when Garrett's men attacked during the vows, about how your mother took down a grown man twice her size using nothing but Apache fighting techniques she'd learned as a girl, about how her father, the man who'd abandoned her for 12 years, finally found a moment of courage when it mattered most. Jack fed the fire one last time, building it up for the night. But tonight you need to sleep. We have a long ride ahead of us tomorrow, and you need to understand something before we continue. The choices I made back then, they weren't perfect. People died because of them. Good people who deserve better. But I'd make the same choices again because the alternative was unthinkable. He pulled his blanket around his shoulders and settled back against his saddle. Your father once told me that a man is defined not by the easy choices he makes when everything is going well, but by the hard choices he makes when everything is falling apart. I didn't understand what he meant until that night by the stream, when I had to decide between keeping one promise and breaking another. The desert night pressed in around them, vast and ancient and indifferent to human struggles. Above, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, bearing witness to stories told and untold across countless campfires just like this one. Sleep now, Jack said quietly. Tomorrow we ride home. Tomorrow you'll see your mother again and your little sister. Tomorrow you'll see the ranch we built from nothing but determination and the refusal to let evil win. And tomorrow night, I'll tell you the rest of the story. The part about the wedding and the battle and the price we all paid for freedom. Danny lay down in his bedroll, but his eyes stayed open, staring up at the infinite stars. Pa, he said after a moment, using the name he'd started calling Jack 3 years ago. Yeah, son? When you were sitting by that stream, deciding what to do, what made you finally choose to stay? Jack was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute truth. You did, Danny, the promise I made to your father. Because if I'd taken the easy way out and disappeared into the desert, I'd have been abandoning you the same way Blackwell abandoned Nayeli. And I couldn't do that. Wouldn't do that. So I stayed. I married a woman I'd known for less than a day, and I walked straight into a trap with my eyes wide open. He paused, then added quietly, best decision I ever made. The fire burned low between them, casting long shadows across the desert floor. In the distance, a coyote called again, its voice lonely and wild. And somewhere in that vast darkness, the future waited like a promise yet to be kept. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky with streaks of gold and crimson when Danny woke. Jack was already up, tending to the horses and checking their gear with the methodical precision of a man who had learned that survival often depended on small details. The fire had burned down to ash and ember, but the coffee pot was already steaming, filling the cool desert air with its bitter aroma. They rode in comfortable silence for most of the morning, the landscape shifting gradually from high desert scrub to rolling grassland as they descended toward the valley where the ranch lay. Danny knew better than to rush the story. Jack would continue when he was ready, when the time felt right. It was late afternoon when they finally made camp again, this time in a shallow arroyo that provided shelter from the wind that swept across the high plains. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too vivid to be real. As Jack built the fire and prepared their simple meal of beans and hardtack, Danny could feel the anticipation building. The story from last night had left him with more questions than answers, and he knew the most important parts were still to come. Finally, after they had eaten and the fire was burning steady, Jack settled back against his saddle and began to speak. You asked last night what happened at the wedding, he said, his voice carrying easily in the still evening air. But to understand that, you need to understand what happened the morning after I met your mother by the stream. He paused, gathering his thoughts like a man loading bullets into a cylinder. Each one had to fit precisely, or the whole mechanism would fail. I didn't sleep much that night. Kept thinking about everything Tazi had told me, everything Nayeli had revealed. 2 men dead, maybe more. Garrett waiting back in Red Ridge like a spider in a web. Blackwell's desperation and debt. And you sitting in that ranch house, trusting that I'd come back. Jack prodded the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. Morning came whether I was ready or not. The sun rose over the Apache camp, and I knew I had to make my choice. I could ride away, take my chances getting you out of Blackwell's ranch, disappear into the territory, and hope Garrett never found us. Or I could stay, marry a woman I barely knew, and walk straight into whatever trap was waiting. The weight of that decision still showed in his face, even after 3 years. Taze found me standing outside his lodge, watching the camp wake up. Women starting cooking fires, children beginning their morning chores, men checking weapons and horses. A whole community going about their lives like it was any other day. Except it wasn't. Jack's voice took on a different quality now, more formal, as if recounting something sacred. Taze told me he'd called everyone together, said there would be a ceremony, but only if certain conditions were met. And the first condition was non-negotiable. Nayeli had to agree publicly and willingly, or there would be no marriage. The Apache way doesn't allow for forced unions. A woman's choice is sacred, and no amount of money or land or political maneuvering could change that. Danny leaned forward, completely absorbed. Blackwell was furious when he heard, started blustering about contracts and agreements, about how he'd brought me all this way and deserved to have the matter settled. But Tazai just looked at him with those cold eyes and said one sentence that shut him up completely. Jack paused for effect. He said, you abandoned your daughter for 12 years. You have no rights here. She will choose, or there will be nothing. The image of that confrontation painted itself clearly in Jack's words. So they gathered everyone in the center of the camp. Must have been 150 people in a circle around us. Nayeli stood in the middle, wearing traditional Apache clothing, her hair loose down her back. She looked every inch the daughter of 2 worlds, neither wholly one nor the other, but something unique and powerful in her own right. Jack's voice softened slightly, remembering. She spoke in Apache first. I couldn't understand the words, but I could hear the strength in her voice, the absolute certainty. Later, Taze told me she'd said that this was her choice and hers alone, that no man had the right to decide her fate, not her father, not the white man's laws, not even the traditions of her people if they conflicted with her will. The significance of that declaration hung heavy in the desert air. Then she switched to English, so everyone could understand, so there would be no question about what she was choosing. And Danny, I'll never forget her words as long as I live. Jack straightened up, his voice taking on the cadence of quotation. She said, I choose this man not because my father demands it, not because the law requires it. I choose him because he asked me what I wanted. This marriage will be legal on paper, but my heart remains my own. If he wants my heart, he must prove worthy of it. The power of that statement still resonated across the years. Then it was my turn to speak. Taze had taught me some Apache words the night before, sitting in his lodge until well past midnight. My accent was terrible, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds, but I spoke them anyway. Jack's voice grew quieter, more intimate. I said I respected her freedom, that I would not demand her heart. I promised only that no one would force her to do anything she didn't want to do, including me. That was my vow, spoken half in broken Apache and half in English. Simple words, but I meant every one of them. The fire crackled and popped. Jack added another piece of mesquite before continuing. Taze placed his hands on both our heads, held them there for 15 seconds that felt like an eternity. No one moved, no one spoke. Just the sound of wind across the desert and the soft beating of Apache drums in the background. And then it was done. We were married in the eyes of the tribe and the law. But the peace of that moment was short-lived, and Jack's voice took on a harder edge. We had maybe 30 seconds of calm before everything went to hell. 3 men burst into the camp riding hard, guns drawn. They didn't shoot right away, which told me they had orders to take Nayeli alive. Dead, she was useless to Garrett. He needed her alive to sign documents, to make the transfer of land look legal. The violence of that moment came through clearly in Jack's telling. The first man lunged at Nayeli, trying to grab her and drag her onto his horse. I moved to intercept him, hit him hard enough to break his nose. Blood everywhere, and he went down hard, but there were 2 more coming fast. Jack demonstrated with his hands, showing the angles of attack. The second man pulled his gun, was bringing it up to shoot, but an Apache warrior put an arrow through his shoulder before he could fire. The man screamed and dropped the weapon, clutching at the shaft buried deep in muscle. The sequence of events unfolded with precise clarity. The third man was smarter. He came in from behind, got his arm around Nayeli's throat before anyone could stop him, had her in a chokehold, was dragging her backward toward his horse. I started moving toward them, but I was too far away. Wasn't going to make it in time. Jack paused and a slight smile crossed his face. That's when your mother proved she didn't need anyone to save her. She used an Apache fighting technique Taze had taught her when she was just a girl. Stomped down hard on the man's instep with her heel, all her weight behind it. Heard the bones break even from where I was standing. He loosened his grip just enough, and she drove her elbow back into his face. Felt his nose shatter under the impact. The pride in his voice was unmistakable. Then she grabbed his arm, used his own momentum against him, and flipped him over her hip. He hit the ground so hard it knocked the wind out of him. Before he could recover, I was there. Kicked his gun away and put him in a chokehold until he stopped fighting. Danny was staring at Jack with wide eyes, beginning to understand the kind of woman his mother truly was. But here's the thing, son. While all this was happening, there was a 4th man. He'd been hanging by, watching, waiting for his moment. When he saw his companions going down, he panicked, started to run. This was where the story took its first unexpected turn. Harlan Blackwell pulled his weapon and shot the man in the leg. Not a killing shot, but enough to drop him. And Danny, that was the first time in 12 years that Blackwell had protected anyone other than himself. The significance of that action was not lost on either of them. Everyone froze. Even the Apache warriors stopped moving, just staring at Blackwell like they couldn't believe what they'd just seen. The man who'd abandoned his daughter, who'd conspired with Garrett, who'd sent other men to their deaths, had just shot one of Garrett's men to keep him from escaping. Jack let that image settle before continuing. We had 4 prisoners now, 3 wounded, 1 terrified. Taze ordered his warriors to secure them, and then he did something that showed me why he'd survived as chief for so many years. He questioned them right there in front of everyone. No privacy, no chance to get their stories straight. The interrogation had been brutal in its efficiency. The man Blackwell shot was bleeding badly, knew he might die if he didn't get help soon. Taze asked him who sent them. The man tried to lie at first, said they were just passing through, but Taze had one of the warriors press on his wound, and the truth came spilling out fast after that. Jack's voice grew colder, harder. He said Garrett had paid them $1,000 to kidnap Nayeli, bring her back alive so Garrett could force her to sign documents transferring the land. After that, they had orders to kill her and make it look like an accident. Claimed she tried to escape, fell from a horse, broke her neck. Something plausible that wouldn't raise too many questions. The casual planning of murder made the desert night feel darker. But then I asked the question that changed everything. I asked what Blackwell knew about this plan, and the wounded man, bleeding and scared and figuring he was going to die anyway, he started laughing. The memory of that laughter still carried a chill. He looked right at Blackwell and said, he knew everything. Said Blackwell had agreed to the whole plan. Blackwell would get his debts cleared if he let Garrett take Nayeli's land. That was the deal they'd made months ago, before I ever arrived in Red Ridge. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Nayeli turned to look at her father. I can still see her face in my mind, the way hope and denial and rage all fought for control. She asked him one simple question. Is it true? Jack paused, letting the weight of that moment hang in the air. Blackwell couldn't speak, couldn't deny it, couldn't explain it away. He just stood there silent, and his silence was all the answer Nayeli needed. She turned her back on him and walked away. Didn't say another word, didn't look at him again. Just walked away like he'd already ceased to exist. The image of that rejection was powerful and final. Blackwell reached out toward her, hand extended like he wanted to touch her shoulder to stop her, to say something that might make it better, but his hand just hung there in the air between them. 10 full seconds he stood like that, arm outstretched towards a daughter who was already gone. Then he dropped his hand and stood there shaking like a man with fever. Jack stood and walked to the edge of the firelight, looking out into the darkness. That's when I had to make another choice. The smart thing would have been to take you and disappear. The marriage was legal, we had witnesses, we could have run and hoped Garrett never found us. But I'd made a promise during that ceremony, a promise that no one would force Nayeli to do anything she didn't want to do. And running away, leaving her to deal with Garrett and her father alone, that would have been breaking that promise. He turned back to face Danny. So I stayed, told Taze we needed to talk, just the 4 of us. Him, Nayeli, Blackwell, and me. We went to Tazi's private lodge while the warriors took the prisoners away to be guarded. The atmosphere in that lodge must have been thick with tension and unspoken accusation. Nayeli spoke first, asked her father directly about the deal with Garrett, asked if he'd known men would die, asked if he'd planned all of this from the beginning. And Blackwell, to his credit, told the truth. All of it. Jack sat back down, his movements slower now, weighted by memory. He told us about when Ayanna died 12 years ago, how something inside him broke, like a rope stretched too far that finally snaps. He started drinking, gambling, making bad investments, trying to chase losses from previous bad investments. By 1878, he was drowning in debt and desperate. The downward spiral was painted in careful detail. That's when he met Samuel Garrett. Garrett had just bought the bank in Red Ridge, seemed legitimate and professional. Offered Blackwell $10,000 at 20% interest, said it was a fair rate for the time. Blackwell was confident he could pay it back within a year. Had some cattle deals lined up, some mining prospects that looked promising. So he took the money. Jack pulled out his journal again, showing Danny the calculations. But the cattle deals fell through. The mining prospects turned out to be worthless, and the debt kept growing. 20% interest compounds fast when you're not making payments. After 7 years, That 10,000 had grown to 50,000, and Blackwell didn't have it. Couldn't pay, couldn't even make the interest payments anymore. The mathematical inevitability of the trap was clear. Garrett came to him with a solution. Said it was simple. Blackwell's daughter owned 5,000 acres with a valuable silver mine. Get someone to marry her. The husband would legally control the property under territorial law. Then Garrett would persuade that husband to sign over the mineral rights. After that, arrange an accident. Husband dies, Nayeli becomes a widow with no legal claim, Garrett gets the mine, and Blackwell's debts disappear. The cold calculation of it was chilling. Blackwell agreed. He admitted it right there in front of all of us. Said he was terrified of what Garrett would do if he refused. Garrett had killed before, made people disappear. Blackwell chose his own safety over his daughter's life. Nayeli's question came next, sharp and direct. She asked him why he couldn't just sell his ranch, pay the debt, start over somewhere else. And Blackwell told her the ranch was already mortgaged beyond its value. He'd borrowed against it years ago, used the money to chase more bad investments. He had nothing left except Nayeli's land, and that wasn't his to sell. So he decided to steal it through legal manipulation and a desperate stranger who needed money badly enough to agree to anything. The complete picture of Blackwell's fall was now visible. Then Nayeli asked the question that cut deepest. Why did you send me away 12 years ago? If you loved me, if you cared at all, why did you abandon me? Jack's voice grew quieter, more gentle. And Blackwell told her the truth about that too. When Ayanna died, he couldn't look at Nayeli. She looked exactly like her mother. Same eyes, same smile, same way of moving through the world. Every time he saw his daughter, he saw his dead wife, and the grief was so overwhelming, he felt like he was drowning in it. The human weakness behind the cruelty made it no less painful. He sent Nayeli away to save himself, not to punish her. Told himself it was temporary, that he'd heal and bring her back in 6 months like he promised. But months turned into years, and the guilt of abandoning her made it harder to face her, which made him avoid her more, which created more guilt, a spiral he couldn't escape. So he just stopped trying. Danny was beginning to understand the complexity of human failure. I asked Blackwell one more question. Did you know Garrett would kill me too? And he nodded. Said he knew, tried to justify it by saying I was a drifter, that no one would miss me, that I'd chosen to take the risk. But even saying it out loud, you could hear how hollow it sounded, how he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. The confession was complete, and what came next would determine everything. Nayeli stood up and walked out of the lodge without saying another word to her father. Left him sitting there with his guilt and his excuses. But she didn't leave the camp. I found her standing at the edge, looking out toward the desert, toward Red Ridge, toward the confrontation she knew was coming. Jack's voice took on a different tone now, more determined. I asked her what she wanted to do, and she told me straight. Go to Red Ridge, confront Garrett, take back her land, make sure no one else could do to other families what had been done to her. The plan was forming, piece by piece. I told her I was staying, that I'd help her fight. She asked why, said our marriage was legal now, and I could leave with you, that she released me from any obligation. But I told her I'd made a promise during the ceremony. No one would force her to do anything she didn't want to do, and that promise included protecting her from men who would kill her for her land. The bond between them was strengthening, built on honesty rather than deception. She looked at me for a long time, maybe 8 seconds, just studying my face like she was trying to see into my soul. Then she said we needed a plan. We couldn't just ride into Red Ridge and expect to win through confrontation. Garrett had money, men, legal documents that appeared legitimate. We had truth, but truth without power is just noise. Jack described the strategy session that followed. We went back to Taze's lodge, but this time Blackwell wasn't invited, just Taze, his senior warriors, Nayeli, and me. We discussed what we knew about Garrett, how he'd stolen land from 15 families over 5 years using forged court documents and bribed judges, how he maintained a small army of hired guns disguised as ranch hands, how he was connected to territorial officials who looked the other way when convenient. The scope of the corruption was daunting. I proposed 3 objectives. First, prove the court documents were forged. Second, gather the families Garrett had wronged and convince them to stand together. Third, get word to the territorial governor in Santa Fe about the crimes. If we could accomplish all three, we might have enough legal weight to stop Garrett without it turning into a bloodbath. Taze's support was crucial. Taze agreed immediately, said he'd send his fastest riders to Santa Fe that night. They could make the journey in 5 days instead of the usual 7 by using desert trails most white men didn't know about. They would carry documents detailing everything we knew about Garrett's crimes, along with testimony from the families he'd victimized. But there was still the problem of Blackwell. Nayeli didn't want her father involved. Didn't trust him, didn't want to be in the same territory as him. But Tazi made an argument I hadn't expected. He said Blackwell knew exactly how Garrett operated because he'd helped him, knew where Garrett kept his records, knew the names of the men he'd bribed, knew which judges were corrupt, and most importantly, Garrett still thought Blackwell was on his side. The strategic value was undeniable. Taze proposed giving Blackwell one chance, one opportunity to prove he could choose differently. If he helped us get evidence against Garrett, he could begin to earn back Nayeli's trust. If he betrayed us, the Apache warriors would make sure he never betrayed anyone again. The terms were clear and non-negotiable. Nayeli agreed, but only on one condition. Blackwell would not speak to her, would not try to apologize or explain or justify himself. He would do his job, help us get the evidence we needed, and then leave her alone forever. Blackwell accepted those terms without argument. Taze assigned 2 warriors to watch Blackwell every moment. If he tried to warn Garrett or betray us in any way, they had orders to kill him immediately. No hesitation, no second chances. Blackwell understood. You could see it in his face. The weight of knowing his life hung by a thread, and only his own actions could determine whether that thread would hold. The journey back to Red Ridge took 3 days. We rode through country that was beautiful and harsh in equal measure. Cholla cactus and ocotillo standing like sentinels, the occasional Joshua tree twisted into shapes that seemed almost human, and everywhere the sense that the land itself was watching, waiting to see if we were strong enough to survive its indifference. On the second night, Jack had a conversation with Blackwell that revealed something unexpected. While Nayeli was checking on the horses, I sat with Blackwell, not because I liked him or trusted him, but because I needed to understand him. I asked what he would do if we succeeded. If we stopped Garrett and secured Nayeli's land, what then? Blackwell's answer was honest in its uncertainty. He said he didn't know. Said he'd spent so many years running from grief that he didn't know how to do anything else. He asked me if I thought Nayeli would ever forgive him. Jack's response carried the wisdom of hard experience. I told him forgiveness wasn't something he could demand or expect. It was something Nayeli might choose to give or might not. The only thing he could control was whether he became worthy of forgiveness. And that would take years of consistent action, not words or promises. The conversation took a deeper turn. I told Blackwell about your father, about how James Ward saved my life at Shiloh by pulling me out of that burning supply wagon, about the promise I made at his deathbed to take care of you, about how keeping promises to the dead is how we honor them, how we prove their lives mattered. The parallel was clear. I said Blackwell had made promises too, to Ayana when he married her, and to baby Nayeli when she was born. He'd broken all of them. But breaking a promise doesn't mean you can never make another one. It just means the next one has to be kept, no matter the cost. Then Jack asked the question directly. Do you think I'm a coward? That's what Blackwell wanted to know. And I told him the truth. Yes, I thought he was a coward. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. But Jack didn't leave it there. I told him that every brave person I ever knew had been a coward at some point first. Bravery isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act despite fear. Blackwell could choose to be brave now, even after 12 years of cowardice. That choice was always available, right up until the moment he died. They reached Red Ridge on the afternoon of the 3rd day. You came running out when you saw us approaching, Danny. You'd been terrified, the fear plain in your eyes. But you'd hidden it well. Had been brave the way children are brave when they have no choice. You asked me about Nayeli, asked if she was my wife. I said it was complicated. The introduction between Nayeli and Danny had been significant. Your mother knelt down to your eye level and introduced herself. Said you could call her Nayeli, not ma'am or Mrs. Brennan. She didn't like formalities. You looked at me to see if that was okay, and I nodded. You said you thought you'd like her, and right then, I knew everything was going to work out somehow. Over the next 2 days, bonds formed that would prove crucial. Nayeli taught you things, how to read animal tracks, how to move quietly through brush, basic Apache words. You were fascinated by her and she relaxed around you in a way she didn't with adults. Maybe because you didn't judge her, didn't care that she was Apache or that her father had abandoned her. You just saw someone who knew interesting things and was willing to teach them. Meanwhile, Jack was building their alliance in town. I went into Red Ridge and started gathering information, visited the saloon, talked to shopkeepers, confirmed what Taze had told us. 15 families had lost land to Garrett's schemes over 5 years. Most were afraid to speak openly, but in private conversations their anger came through. They wanted justice but didn't believe it was possible. Garrett seemed untouchable. The key ally came from an unexpected source. I met a man named Joseph Carter, 68 years old, a veteran of Gettysburg. He'd lost 80 acres to Garrett 3 years before, land that had been in his family since before the Mexican War. When I explained what we were trying to do, that Nayeli was willing to lead the fight, and that we had evidence coming from Santa Fe, something shifted in his eyes. Jack smiled at the memory. Joseph said he was old but not dead, said he'd fought for principle at Gettysburg and he'd do it again. He agreed to help gather the other families, to convince them that together they had power. One person could be silenced or threatened, but 15 families standing together was harder to dismiss. The trap for Garrett was being set carefully. Blackwell used his access to Garrett's bank to identify where the forged documents were kept. There was a safe in Garrett's private office. Blackwell had been in that office before, back when he still thought Garrett was legitimate. He'd even helped organize some of the paperwork. Now that knowledge became useful. The plan required Garrett to feel confident. Blackwell visited Garrett with fake news, said I'd agreed to sign over the mineral rights, that the marriage was legitimate and I could be bought for the right price. Garrett was pleased, set up a meeting for 4 days from then to finalize the paperwork. But the real plan was different. We weren't actually going to sign anything. We needed Garrett to gather all his documentation in one place, have his lawyers ready, bring together everything that would prove his crimes. Then when the territorial governor's representative arrived, we'd have Garrett trapped with all the evidence right there. It was a good plan, but plans rarely survive first contact unchanged. The night before they were supposed to meet with Garrett, everything changed. Billy Turner came riding up to the ranch like the devil himself was chasing him. And in a way he was. Billy was the young gunfighter who'd warned me about Nayeli back in the desert. 19 years old, still had enough conscience left to know right from wrong, even if he worked for the wrong people. Billy's warning was dire. He said Garrett knew something was wrong, didn't know the details, but his instincts were screaming danger. He'd sent word to El Paso for reinforcements. 10 professional killers were coming, would arrive by morning. Once they got there, Garrett would make his move. Take Nayeli by force, kill anyone who resisted, sort out the legalities later with forged documents claiming self-defense. The timeline had collapsed catastrophically. We didn't have 4 days anymore. We didn't even have 1 full day. We had maybe 12 hours before those reinforcements arrived, and our slim advantage disappeared completely. Jack called an emergency meeting. Everyone gathered, Nayeli, Blackwell, Tazai's 2 warriors who'd come with us, Joseph Carter, the heads of the 15 families we'd recruited. I laid out the situation. We had to act tonight, had to get the evidence tonight, had to be ready for a fight by morning because that fight was coming whether we wanted it or not. You asked how many guns we had, Danny. Do you remember? Danny nodded silently. I counted them out. 12 men from the families willing to fight. 2 Apache warriors, Blackwell, me, 16 total. And Garrett had at least 20 men already, plus 10 more coming. We were outnumbered even before the reinforcements arrived. But Nayeli's response had been fierce and determined. She said numbers didn't matter. We had truth on our side. I told her truth doesn't stop bullets. She met my eyes and said then we'd have to be faster, smarter, and more committed than men only fighting for money. There was steel in her voice, absolute conviction that we'd win because we had to win. The responsibilities were divided quickly. Blackwell would break into Garrett's office that night and steal the forged documents. He had until midnight. If he wasn't back by midnight, we'd assume he'd been caught or had betrayed us. The Apache warriors would watch the roads for Garrett's reinforcements. I would position our defenders around the ranch, and Nayeli would coordinate the families, make sure everyone understood their role. At 10 that night, Blackwell rode into town. The two Apache warriors shadowed him from a distance, ready to kill him if he went anywhere except the bank. I watched them disappear into the darkness, then turned to organizing our defenses. We reinforced the ranch house windows with extra boards, positioned water barrels in case of fire, distributed ammunition, assigned fields of fire so no one would accidentally shoot an ally. The waiting was agonizing. As midnight approached, tension mounted. I stationed myself where I could see the road from town, Winchester ready. At 5 minutes before midnight, I saw movement, a single rider coming fast. The moment of truth had arrived. I raised my rifle, then lowered it when I recognized Blackwell's horse. He rode straight to the ranch house, dismounted before the horse fully stopped, and ran inside carrying a leather satchel that he dropped on the table with a heavy thud. What was inside exceeded all expectations. Blackwell hadn't just stolen the forged court orders. He'd taken Garrett's entire record-keeping system. Lists of bribes paid, names of judges who took money, detailed accounts of every illegal land seizure for the past 7 years. It wasn't just evidence. It was a complete indictment. For the first time, Nayeli looked at her father with something that might have been the beginning of respect. She didn't say anything, but Blackwell noticed her look, seemed to stand a little straighter, like maybe he'd finally done something worthy of his daughter's acknowledgement. Jack immediately sent a rider to intercept the territorial governor's representative. The rider carried a letter explaining everything and asking him to come immediately with federal marshals if possible. Then we waited. Waiting before a fight is always the hardest part. Your mind invents 1,000 disasters. Your body wants to move, to act, to do something. But discipline means staying in position, staying ready. In the early morning hours, Jack found Nayeli on the roof. She'd set up a sniper position, lying flat with the rifle, watching the road. I climbed up and sat next to her for maybe 90 seconds. Neither of us spoke, just watched the stars and listened to the desert night. Then she said something I'll never forget. Jack's voice grew softer, more intimate. She said she was afraid, not of dying, but of failing, of letting down all the families depending on her, of proving her father right that she wasn't capable of managing her inheritance. I told her that fear was reasonable, that anyone who wasn't afraid before a fight was either stupid or lying. He shared his own vulnerability then. I told her I was afraid too, afraid of failing you, Danny, that I'd promised your father I'd keep you safe, and here I was bringing you into a war zone. Your mother said you were safer with us than anywhere else if Garrett won, that sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't fighting, it's running and hoping evil won't follow. They sat in silence for another moment before Nayeli asked the question. She asked if our marriage was real or just paperwork. I didn't answer right away. It deserved thought. Finally, I said it started as paperwork but was becoming something else, something neither of us had planned, but both of us recognized. The honesty between them was building something solid. She said she felt the same way, that she hadn't wanted to need anyone but was starting to think that needing people isn't weakness. It's just being human. We sat together until dawn started to lighten the eastern sky. Not touching, but not separate either. Just two people facing impossible odds and finding comfort in shared presence. As the sun rose, their lookout spotted dust on the horizon. Riders coming from the south. Garrett's reinforcements from El Paso. I counted 10 men riding hard. They'd reach town within the hour. That meant we had maybe 2 hours before Garrett organized his forces and came for us. The battle was coming. Jack stood and looked toward the distant lights of the ranch. That's where we stop tonight, son. Tomorrow night, the last night before we reach home, I'll tell you about the battle, about how your mother proved she was the best shot any of us had ever seen, about how Billy Turner, that 19-year-old kid, found enough courage to defy Garrett even though he knew it would cost him his life, about how Joseph Carter died defending what was right, and about how your grandfather, the man who'd abandoned his daughter for 12 years, finally found the courage to become the father she deserved. The fire burned low between them. Danny looked like he wanted to protest, wanted to hear the rest immediately, but he also understood that some stories needed to be parceled out carefully, digested in pieces. Sleep now, Jacka said. Tomorrow we ride the last leg home. Tomorrow night I'll finish the story, and the day after you'll see your mother again, and your little sister. You'll see the community we built from blood and determination. And you'll understand why some prices are worth paying, even when they cost everything you have. The desert night wrapped around them like a blanket, vast and ancient and full of secrets. And somewhere in that darkness, the past and the future waited, patient as stone, for the final chapter to unfold. The third and final night found them camped within sight of the ranch, close enough that Danny could see the lights burning in the windows. Home was less than an hour away, but Jack insisted on making camp one last time. Some stories needed to be finished before you could cross certain thresholds, before you could walk back into a life built on the foundation of hard choices and harder sacrifices. The fire burned bright against the cool October darkness. Danny sat cross-legged, his full attention on Jack, who stared into the flames as if reading the past written there in ash and ember. The weight of what remained to be told hung between them like smoke, visible and intangible all at once. The moment before violence starts, Jack began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who had thought long and hard about what he was going to say. There's always a pause, a held breath where the world seems to stop spinning. Everyone knows what's coming. Everyone has chosen their path. But for one perfect instant, everything balances on a knife's edge between peace and war. He looked up at Danny, his eyes reflecting the firelight. That morning, with 30 of Garrett's guns pointed at us and the sun climbing toward noon, that moment stretched longer than it should have. Maybe 5 full seconds where no one moved, no one breathed. Just 2 groups of armed men facing each other across 50 yards of New Mexico dirt, knowing that when the shooting started, some of them wouldn't be alive to see sunset. Jack fed another piece of mesquite to the fire, watching it catch and burn. But before I tell you about the battle, you need to understand what happened in the hours leading up to it, the choices that were made, the lines that were drawn. Because violence doesn't just happen, it's the end result of 100 small decisions, each one pushing things a little closer to the edge until someone finally falls off. He settled back against his saddle, gathering the threads of his story. I gathered everyone at first light and gave them a speech. Wasn't much good at speeches, never have been, but they needed to hear something from me before the shooting started. I told them that when the fighting began, some of us might die. That was just the reality of violence. But dying for something that matters is different than dying for nothing. Jack's voice grew stronger, more certain. I said they were fighting for their homes, their families, their futures. Garrett's men were fighting for money. That difference meant something. It had to mean something. Or what were we doing out there in the first place? The memory of that morning was still vivid in his mind. Joseph Carter stood up then. That old man with his gray beard and his Gettysburg scars stood up in front of everyone and spoke. His voice was cracking but strong. He said he'd fought in the bloodiest war this country ever saw. Watched boys die with principle and honor and freedom. This fight was small compared to that, he said, but it was no less important. Jack paused, honoring the memory of a brave man. Joseph said he'd rather die defending what was right than live one more day under Garrett's shadow. And when he said it, every man there agreed. You could see it in their faces. The alliance was solid. Their resolve was unshakable. But that didn't change the mathematics of violence. We were still outnumbered, still facing professional killers, still one mistake away from complete disaster. The arrival that changed those odds came at 8 that morning. A rider came from town, but it wasn't one of Garrett's men. It was the territorial governor's representative. He'd received our message and ridden through the night with 4 federal marshals. The odds had just shifted. Now we had 21 guns against Garrett's 30, still outnumbered, but not as badly. But Jack was quick to temper any false hope. Don't think that made it easy, Danny. 6 more men helped, but Garrett still had superior numbers. And more importantly, Garrett wasn't going to surrender peacefully. He knew those documents proved his crimes, knew that capture meant hanging. Men with nothing to lose are the most dangerous kind because they'll fight until they can't fight anymore. The standoff lasted until noon. Garrett and his entire force rode up to the ranch in a slow, deliberate formation. 30 armed men arrayed like a military unit, disciplined and ready. Garrett rode at the front, 46 years old, well-dressed, groomed like a gentleman banker. If you'd seen him on the street in Santa Fe, you'd have thought he was a successful businessman. Which he was, technically. His business just happened to be theft and murder disguised as banking. Jack described the confrontation with precise detail. Garrett called out from 50 yards away, said he knew we'd taken something that belonged to him and he wanted it back. Return his property, have Nayeli sign over her land, and everyone lives. Refuse and he'd burn the ranch to the ground with everyone inside. Simple as that. No negotiation, no compromise, just an ultimatum. Nayeli's response had been equally direct. Your mother stood up where Garrett could see her. Voice rang out clear and strong across that distance. She told him his documents were with the territorial governor's representative, that charges were being filed, that he could surrender now and face trial or resist and face death. His choice. The laughter that followed was chilling. Garrett laughed. Not a happy sound, nothing warm or amused in it. He said the documents didn't matter. Judges could be bribed. Witnesses could disappear. He'd been untouchable for years and would remain so. Then he gave a signal and his men raised their weapons. The battle was about to begin. But what happened next, no one expected. Before Garrett's hand could drop to signal the attack, a young voice called out. Billy Turner rode forward from behind Garrett's line. That 19-year-old kid was shaking so hard you could see it from 50 yards away, but he rode forward anyway. The courage of that moment still resonated. Billy positioned himself between Garrett and us, turned in his saddle to face his boss, his employer, the man who paid his wages. And in a voice that cracked with fear but never wavered, he said he wasn't going to be part of murder. Said he'd signed on as a ranch hand, not an assassin. Said his mother had raised him better than this. Jack's voice carried both pride and sorrow. Garrett told him to move or die with us, and Billy didn't move. Just sat there on his horse, shaking like a leaf in a storm, but holding his position. Holding it because it was right, even though it terrified him. Others followed Billy's example. 2 more of Garrett's men rode forward to join him. Then another. Within 30 seconds, 6 men had defected. The odds were shifting in our favor, but Garrett's response was immediate and brutal. The violence was sudden and shocking. He pulled his pistol and shot Billy through the chest. Didn't hesitate, didn't warn him again. Just killed him for having the courage to defy orders. Billy fell from his horse and hit the ground hard. The other 5 men who'd defected scattered, riding fast for safety. And that's when the shooting started. The battle unfolded in chaos and noise. Not with strategy or planning, but with fury. Garrett's remaining men opened fire. We returned fire. The territorial representative and his marshals added their guns to ours. For 90 seconds, it was just noise and smoke and confusion. Bullets whining through the air, men shouting, horses screaming. The kind of chaos where you can't think, can only react on instinct and training. The first casualties came fast. We lost John Patterson in those first 90 seconds, farmer who'd lost his land 3 years before. Bullet caught him in the throat and he died before he hit the ground. On Garrett's side, 4 men went down, 1 dead, 3 wounded. The mathematics of violence playing out in real time. The formation broke as men sought cover. Garrett's men scattered for rocks, ditches, anywhere offering protection. The single battle became a dozen small skirmishes happening simultaneously. I was positioned on the east side of the house with you and 3 other men, Danny. Our job was to hold that approach, prevent them from flanking us. Jack looked directly at his son. You were 11 years old and terrified. The fear showed in your eyes, in the way your hands shook when you loaded rifles. But you didn't run, didn't freeze. You did exactly what needed doing. Kept ammunition moving, stayed low when bullets came close. That's the definition of courage, son. Not the absence of fear, but doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. The battle on the roof was its own story. Your mother was up there with her rifle, acting as our sniper. She had the best vantage point and the steadiest hand of anyone there. She started picking off Garrett's men one by one, and she never missed. Not once. The pride in Jack's voice was unmistakable. She didn't shoot to kill unless she had to, aimed for shoulders, legs, anywhere that would take a man out of the fight without ending his life. 3 shots, 3 men down. The survivors started to realize they were being hunted by someone with exceptional skill. That fear began to crack their discipline, made them hesitate before exposing themselves. 15 minutes into the fight, something unexpected happened. Blackwell did something I didn't see coming. He left his defensive position inside the house and ran toward where Billy's body lay in the open ground between both forces. Bullets were kicking up dirt all around him. I thought he'd lost his mind. But Blackwell had a purpose. He made it to Billy's body and stood up, completely exposed, an easy target for anyone with a clear shot. He looked directly at Garrett and shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. Jack paused, letting the significance build. He said Billy was 19 years old, that his mother lived in Albuquerque, that someone would have to tell her that her son died trying to do the right thing. Then he said every man fighting for Garrett needed to think about whether money was worth dying for. The effect was immediate. 2 more of Garrett's men threw down their weapons and rode away. They weren't willing to deed for a man who killed his own employees for having a conscience. Garrett screamed at them, but they didn't stop. Now it was 22 against 21. Nearly even odds, but even odds still meant bloodshed. The territorial representative tried one more time to negotiate, called out to Garrett that surrender was still possible, that the governor was prepared to offer leniency to anyone except Garrett himself, that the hired guns could walk away if they put down their weapons immediately. Garrett's response was defiant and final. He shouted back that we'd have to kill him, that he wouldn't hang, that if he was going down, he'd take as many of us with him as possible. It wasn't bravado, it was simple fact. Samuel Garrett had decided he'd rather die fighting than face justice. The fight settled into a grinding exchange. Both sides tried to gain advantage through position and patience rather than reckless charges. The sun climbed higher, heat building. Sweat made weapons slippery. Fear and adrenaline exhausted men faster than physical exertion. It was the kind of fight that could last for hours, each side waiting for the other to make a mistake. Around 11 that morning, Garrett changed tactics. He set fire to the barn. Wind was blowing toward the house and he was trying to smoke us out, force us to abandon our positions to save the horses and livestock. The fire spread quickly through dry hay and old wood. The diversion worked. Me and 5 others had to break cover to rescue the animals. That's when Garrett made his real move. While we were distracted, he sent 10 men in a rush toward the house. They came fast and hard, firing as they ran. It was a suicide charge, but it almost worked. The defenders at the house were suddenly overwhelmed. 3 men against 10 in a matter of seconds. Garrett's men reached the porch. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out. Joseph Carter, that old Gettysburg veteran, was grappling with a man 40 years younger. Joseph was losing until one of the Apache warriors put an arrow through the younger man's leg. Nayeli responded from the roof. Her rifle was cracking steadily. 4 shots, 3 hits. But she couldn't target everyone in the melee below without risk of hitting our own men. That's when Blackwell emerged from inside the house carrying a double-barrel shotgun. The violence that followed was brutal and necessary. He stepped onto the porch and fired both barrels point blank into the cluster of attackers. 2 men went down immediately. The blast was so loud, it momentarily stopped the fighting everywhere. Everyone just froze, stunned by the sudden escalation. Blackwell reloaded with practiced speed, fired again. Another attacker fell. The remaining men on the porch broken and ran. They hadn't expected such fierce resistance, hadn't expected an old man to fight like a cornered animal. Blackwell had bought the defenders crucial seconds to regroup and reorganize. But the cost was mounting. Joseph Carter had been stabbed during the melee. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but it was serious. We got him inside where your mother could try to treat it with what medical supplies we had. He was in pain, but conscious, still giving orders about how to strengthen the defenses, still fighting even as he was bleeding out. The battle continued into the afternoon. Both sides were exhausted, running low on ammunition, operating on fear and determination alone. That's when I heard it, a sound that changed everything. Jack smiled slightly. War cries, Apache war cries coming from the north. Tazi had arrived with 15 warriors. I'd sent word to him that morning through one of his scouts asking for help. The warriors had come fast, using desert trails that cut travel time in half. The Apache attack was devastating in its efficiency. They came from behind and from the side, from directions Garrett's men hadn't anticipated. And they weren't using guns primarily. They were using bows. Silent, deadly, impossible to track by sound. Garrett's men started falling to arrows without warning, without knowing where the attack was coming from. The psychological impact was as important as the physical. Within 20 minutes of Tazi's arrival, Garrett's force had been reduced to 12 men. They were surrounded, outgunned, demoralized. The territorial representative called for surrender again. This time, 8 of the remaining men accepted, threw down their weapons, and raised their hands. That left Garrett with 4 loyalists, men too implicated in his crimes to expect mercy. They knew if they surrendered, they'd hang alongside Garrett, so they had nothing to lose. They made a break for it, tried to fight their way through the Apache warriors to reach their horses. 3 of them died in the attempt. Garrett and 1 other man made it to their mounts and rode hard for town. Your mother shouted at me to let them go, that it was over. But I couldn't. Jack's voice grew harder. Garrett knew too much, had too many connections. If he escaped, he could rebuild his operation somewhere else. This had to end today. So I grabbed a fresh horse and went after them. The chase lasted 5 miles across open desert. I could hear the pounding of hooves, feel the heat shimmering off the sand. Gradually, I realized my horse was faster. I was gaining. Garrett's companion went down first when his horse stepped in a prairie dog hole. The animal went tumbling, and the rider broke his neck in the fall. Now it was just Garrett and Jack. He knew I was closing, turned in his saddle, and fired 3 wild shots that came nowhere close. I didn't return fire, just conserved my ammunition and kept coming. 2 miles from town, Garrett's horse stumbled. Didn't fall, but it slowed enough that I closed the final distance. I rode alongside him and launched myself from my saddle to his. We both went down hard, rolling in the dirt and rocks. Felt like every bone in my body was breaking. The fight was brutal and personal. Garrett was bigger than me, but older, softer. We traded punches. He fought like a man with everything to lose. I fought like a man with people depending on him. There's a difference, Danny. Desperation makes you wild. Responsibility makes you focused. After 90 seconds of savage combat, Jack prevailed. Got him in a chokehold and held it until he went limp. Tied him with his own belt and rope from his saddle, put him face down across his horse, and led both animals back to the ranch. Took over an hour. The whole time Garrett was conscious, cursing, threatening, promising revenge. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say to a man like that. The return to the ranch revealed the full cost. Bodies being gathered, wounded being treated, defenders exhausted, sitting in whatever shade they could find. The territorial representative took custody of Garrett immediately. Federal marshals shackled him and prepared to transport him to Santa Fe for trial. Garrett had last words for Jack. Said I had no idea what I'd done, that he had friends in high places who would make my life hell, that I'd regret crossing him. Jack's response was simple and final. I told him the only thing I regretted was not killing him when I had the chance. Then I turned my back and walked away. Never saw him again. He was tried, convicted of multiple murders and land fraud, and hanged 6 weeks later. But the immediate victory came with heavy losses. We'd lost 3 men total. John Patterson at the beginning, Miguel, a ranch hand during the assault on the house, and Joseph Carter, who died from his stab wound despite your mother's best efforts to save him. The old soldier's death carried particular weight. Joseph held on until after Garrett was captured. When we told him it was over, that we'd won, he smiled, said he could die satisfied, knowing he'd done one last meaningful thing with his life, asked us to make sure his land went to his granddaughter in Colorado. Then he closed his eyes and didn't open them again. Jack paused, letting Danny absorb the weight of that sacrifice. On Garrett's side, 18 men died. Another 9 were seriously wounded. The survivors were arrested and charged according to their level of involvement. Some went to prison. Others were released after testifying against Garrett. The legal aftermath took months to sort through, but the immediate crisis was over. That evening, something unexpected happened. Blackwell asked to speak with Nayeli. She refused at first, didn't want to hear excuses or apologies, but Taze convinced her, said Blackwell had earned the right to speak by fighting when he could have run. The conversation took place on the porch at sunset. I was there as witness at Blackwell's request. He told your mother he didn't expect forgiveness, had no right to ask for it, but he wanted her to know one thing. Jack's voice softened. He said fighting beside her that day was the first time in 12 years he'd felt like a man instead of a coward. That standing up to Garrett, protecting her even in that small way, had made him remember who he used to be, who he could still become if given the chance. Blackwell's request was simple. He asked if she would let him prove through actions that he could be better, not with words or promises, but with steady, consistent behavior over years if necessary. He understood if she never wanted to see him again, but he asked for one chance to earn his way back into her life, one day at a time. Nayeli's silence lasted a long time. I counted the seconds, watched emotions play across her face like storm clouds. Finally, she spoke. The answer carried both justice and mercy. She said he couldn't reclaim the past, couldn't undo 12 years of abandonment, but he could choose who to be going forward. She wouldn't forgive him yet, but she wouldn't shut the door completely. He'd have to earn his way back into her life, one day at a time. Blackwell wept. Not loud crying, but silent tears running down his weathered face and dripping onto the porch boards. Your mother watched him cry and didn't comfort him. That was part of his penance. Living with the consequences without expectation of absolution. But she didn't walk away either. Stayed and let him feel his grief in her presence. That was its own kind of mercy. The days that followed brought more healing than Jack had expected. Your mother officially took control of her land. The territorial governor personally delivered the legal documents. 5,000 acres, mineral rights included, worth somewhere between and $750,000, depending on the quality of the silver vein. But Nayeli's plans surprised everyone. She created a cooperative community. 15% of the land was divided among the 15 families Garrett had wronged. They would own it outright, not as tenants but as partners. Another 15% was given to Taze's Apache band, legally recognized as permanent residents with full rights. The remaining 70% would be managed collectively. The vision was ambitious and unprecedented. She wanted to build something new, a place where Apache and American settlers could live together, share resources, teach each other, prove that her mother's dream of bridging two worlds could work if people were willing to trauma. Danny interrupted with a question. Did it work? Jack smiled. Yes, took years. There were difficulties and misunderstandings and moments when it seemed like it might fall apart. But yes, it worked. The community that exists there now is proof. You'll see it tomorrow when we ride in. Blackwell threw himself into the work. Used his ranch management experience to organize construction and irrigation. Taught younger men about cattle and horses. Never asked for recognition or special treatment from your mother. Just worked alongside everyone else. Over 6 months, something shifted. Father and daughter began to rebuild something that resembled a relationship, not instant reconciliation. She didn't call him father for almost a year, but they worked together, ate meals at the same table, had conversations about practical matters that gradually expanded to include personal topics. Trust grew slowly, like plants in desert soil. Then came the attack that changed everything. 8 months after Garrett's execution, 3 men rode into the community at night. Associates of Garrett's from El Paso. They blamed us for his death and came for revenge. The attack was swift and brutal. Set fire to the barn again, trying to recreate Garrett's tactic. When people ran to fight the fire, the 3 men opened fire from concealment. 2 people were hit in the first volley. One of them was your mother. Jack's voice tightened at the memory. Bullet through the shoulder, not fatal but serious. She went down hard. The shooters repositioned to finish her while she was vulnerable. What happened next defined Blackwell's entire arc. He was near the main house when the shooting started. Ran toward your mother without hesitation. No weapon drawn, no thought for his own safety. Just ran straight into gunfire to put himself between the shooters and his daughter. The sacrifice was complete. He was hit twice, once in the chest, once in the stomach. Both wounds were severe. The Apache warriors killed all three attackers within seconds, but the damage was done. They carried both Blackwell and Nayeli into the house. Your mother's wound was painful but clean. Bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. She would recover fully. But Blackwell was different. The chest wound had collapsed one lung. The stomach wound was bleeding internally. No doctor within 50 miles. No way to save him with the resources we had. Blackwell stayed conscious for about 2 hours. Spent most of that time with your mother. She held his hand. And finally, she called him father. The emotion in Jack's voice was raw and honest. He smiled when she said it, told her he didn't deserve that word, but was grateful to hear it before he died. Used those last hours to say things he should have said years before. Told her that her mother would be proud, that Ayana's dream of bridging two worlds was coming true through their daughter's work. Said he was sorry for being weak when she needed him to be strong, but grateful she'd become strong anyway. Blackwell's final words were simple. He said, I love you. I always loved you. I just didn't know how to show it without fear getting in the way. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. The death was peaceful in its own way. He looked at her face one more time, smiled slightly, and died. Jack let the silence settle before continuing. We buried him on the hill overlooking the land your mother had transformed. Taze performed a ceremony that blended Apache and Christian traditions. Representatives from all 15 families attended. Everyone spoke about how Blackwell had changed in his final months, how he tried to become better. Nayeli spoke last at the funeral. She said her father was not a good man for most of his life, but at the end, he remembered how to be brave. He protected her when it mattered most. She would remember him not as the man who abandoned her, but as the man who came back. Not as the coward, but as the father who finally learned to love without fear. After Blackwell's death, they found something important, a journal in his belongings. He'd been keeping it since your mother returned from the Apache camp. Every day for 8 months writing to her, thoughts he was too afraid to say out loud, apologies he didn't know how to voice, observations watching her become a leader. The last page was particularly poignant. Written the day before he died, said tomorrow he would tell Nayeli he was proud of her, that he saw Ayana in everything she did, that watching her build something beautiful from his ruins gave him hope that redemption was possible, even for men like him. Tomorrow he would be brave enough to say these things. Tomorrow he would finally be the father she deserved. Jack's voice grew quiet. He never got his tomorrow, but we gave the journal to your mother. She read it cover to cover that night. In the morning, she told me she understood her father better. That understanding isn't the same as forgiveness, but it's the beginning. Danny asked what happened next. Life happened, Jack said simply. Your mother and I discovered that our marriage of convenience had become real, not through grand declarations or dramatic moments, but through daily choices to trust each other, support each other, build something together. A year after Blackwell died, they renewed their vows, this time meaning them. The community celebrated with a ceremony that brought together every cultural tradition, Apache, American, Mexican, all represented. 2 years after that, your sister Ayana was born, named after your mother's mother. Taze said it was a good name, that the spirit of the original Ayana would watch over her namesake. Jack looked at Danny with pride. And you grew from that scared 11-year-old into someone this community relies on. You helped teach younger children to read. You learned tracking from your mother better than most grown men. You treat the Apache families with the same respect you show everyone else. Your father James would be proud of who you're becoming. The final lesson was approaching. You asked me 3 nights ago if I was ever scared. Now you know the answer. I was terrified for 3 straight months. Terrified of failing you. Terrified of letting your mother down. Terrified of wrong choices getting good people killed. Jack leaned forward, his eyes intense. But I learned something important. Fear doesn't make you a coward. Fear is just information. It tells you that something matters enough to be afraid of losing it. The question is what you do with that fear. Do you let it paralyze you like it paralyzed Blackwell for 12 years? Or do you feel the fear and act anyway, knowing some things are worth the risk? The wisdom had been earned through blood and loss. Blackwell taught me that it's never too late to change, never too late to choose differently. He wasted 12 years being a coward, but in his final 8 months, he became brave. And that bravery, though late, mattered. It saved your mother's life. It gave him a chance to die with honor instead of shame. Jack stood and began banking the fire for the night. Tomorrow we ride into the ranch. You'll see your mother again properly. Meet Ayana, who's 2 years old and has your stubbornness. See the community that grew from blood and determination. See Blackwell's grave and understand why we honor it despite his failures. He looked toward the distant ranch lights. That community exists because people chose to be brave when being afraid would have been easier. Joseph Carter chose to fight despite his age. Billy chose to defy Garrett knowing it would cost his life. Blackwell chose to shield his daughter despite 12 years of cowardice. And your mother chose to build bridges instead of walls despite every reason to hate. Jack sat back down next to Danny. I tell you this story not to entertain you, but to teach you. Life will give you moments where you have to choose between fear and courage, between selfishness and sacrifice, between giving up and persisting. The choices you make in those moments divide who you become. Danny asked one final question. What does it look like when you do it? Jack smiled. It looks like keeping promises even when they're hard. Looks like staying when running would be easier. Looks like raising a boy who isn't mine by blood, but is mine by choice. And doing my best to help him become someone his father would be proud of. His hand rested on Danny's shoulder. You're becoming that man. You've learned to track, shoot, survive in harsh country. But more importantly, you've learned to be kind to your mother, patient with Ayana, respectful to Tazai, helpful to the community. Those qualities matter more than any skill with weapons or horses. Jack pointed toward the distant hill. Tomorrow when you see Blackwell's grave, read what's carved on the marker. Your mother chose the words carefully. Harlan Blackwell. He found courage when it seemed too late, but it is never too late to do what is right. The core message of the entire story. Not that good always wins or justice always prevails. Sometimes evil wins. Sometimes good people die. But as long as you're breathing, you have the opportunity to choose courage over fear, to choose right over easy, to choose to be better than you were yesterday. They walked to their bedrolls as the fire burned low. Sleep now. Tomorrow we go home. Tomorrow you see what was built from the ashes of violence and corruption. Tomorrow you understand why the story matters. But Danny had one last question. Do you think he found peace at the end? Jack considered carefully before answering. I think he found something better than peace. He found purpose. In his last moments protecting your mother, he finally became the father he always should have been. That mattered more than peace, more than forgiveness. It proved that change was possible, that redemption was real, that a man could be defined by his final choice as much as his lifetime of mistakes. He looked up at the infinite stars. The world measures men by their successes and failures, but I think we should be measured by whether we learn from our mistakes and try to do better. Blackwell failed terribly, but he learned, and at the last moment, when it counted most, he chose right. That's not nothing. That's everything. Danny closed his eyes, the story complete in his mind. Jack watched the embers die, thinking about all the choices that had led to this moment. A boy asleep under desert stars, a ranch waiting in the darkness, a wife and daughter representing a future he'd never imagined possible. 3 years ago, he'd ridden into Red Ridge with nothing but a Winchester and a scared boy. Now he had a family, a community, a purpose. The journey had cost blood and pain and the lives of good people, but it had also proved that sometimes, despite everything, courage and determination could build something lasting from ruins. The fire died. Jack pulled his blanket tight and closed his eyes. Tomorrow they would complete the journey. Tomorrow, Danny would see proof that stories weren't just words, but blueprints for how to live. Tomorrow, the past and present would connect, showing that legacy was not what you inherited, but what you chose to build. In the darkness, the desert held its ancient silence. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. And somewhere between past and future, between memory and hope, the story found its ending in a simple truth. Every day offers the chance to choose courage over fear. And that choice, repeated enough times, can change everything.